The freight car rattled like a loose tooth in a jawbone, a hollow, aching sound that matched the emptiness in Eliza's stomach. She had been crammed in the corner for hours, since long before the sun had scorched the sky to a pale, unforgiving white. Now, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, a wind kicked up. Not a cooling breeze, but a hot, angry gust that carried the grit of the Arizona desert with it. A fine red dust, the very blood of the land, sifted through the cracks in the wooden walls, coating her worn leather shoes and the hem of her simple calico dress. It settled on her skin, a grainy film that mixed with the sweat of her fear. She huddled deeper into herself, a small bundle of misery in the vast, rumbling dark. Her arms were wrapped tight around her middle, clutching a small, lumpy cloth sack to her chest as if it were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. Inside, she could feel the familiar, cool weight of her mother's silver locket. It was a simple thing, tarnished with age, etched with two small doves, but it was all she had left of a life that felt a lifetime away. The metal was a ghost of a mother's touch against the heat of her panic. Each jolt of the train was a fresh wave of terror, a reminder that she was moving farther from everything she had known, but also, hopefully, farther from the men who were hunting her. In the opposite corner, half swallowed by the deepening shadows, sat the cowboy. She had barely seen him when she'd scrambled aboard, a dark shape that had resolved itself into a man. He was tall, even sitting down, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sliver of light from the crack behind him. A wide-brimmed hat was pulled low, obscuring his face entirely, and a long, heavy duster, the color of the dust itself, fell around him. He hadn't moved in hours, hadn't so much as shifted his weight. He was a figure of impossible stillness, like a rock formation the desert had carved and left to weather the ages. He hadn't acknowledged her when she'd whispered her desperate plea to hide under his coat, only lifted the heavy canvas in a silent invitation. She had crawled into the space he made, her small frame pressed against the solid wall of his side, and he had let the duster fall back into place, cloaking them both. The wind howled now, a mournful cry that seemed to seep into the wood of the train car. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track was the only steady beat in a world that had come undone. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the image of Mr. Abernathy's face, the damp lips, the greedy eyes that had looked her over as if she were a piece of livestock at auction. Her father, his own eyes hollowed out by cards and whiskey, had called it a marriage, a respectable arrangement. Eliza knew it for what it was, a sale. The locket felt heavier in her hand. Her mother would have never allowed it, but her mother was gone, taken by the fever 3 winters past, leaving Eliza alone with a man who had gambled away his farm, his pride, and finally, his only daughter. She risked a glance at the cowboy. The brim of his hat still hid his expression. He was looking out a crack in the wall, his posture unchanged, his breathing a slow, even rhythm that she had found herself unconsciously matching. He seemed as much a part of the harsh landscape as the distant mesas they were rattling past. He smelled of leather, horse, and the clean, dry scent of the desert itself. There was no whiskey on his breath, no foulness of the saloons she had been forced to clean. He was a silent, solid presence, and in her terror, that was a strange and unexpected comfort. She didn't know his name, didn't know if he was kind or cruel, but he had offered her the shelter of his coat, and for now, that was enough. Then she heard it. It started as a vibration through the floor, a different rhythm from the train's familiar sway, a heavy, purposeful tread of boots on the carriage roof, moving from the back toward the front. 3 sets of them. Eliza's breath hitched in her throat, a tiny, trapped sound. Her heart, which had been a frantic bird, suddenly felt like a stone. It was them. It had to be them. Abernathy's men. He wouldn't have let her go so easily. The money she'd taken from his lockbox, her dowry. She'd told herself. A pitiful justification was insult enough, But her escape was an affront to his pride. He would have sent men like the ones whose footsteps were now directly overhead. A shadow fell across the sliver of light from the main door. The heavy latch scraped, loud and violent, and the door slid open a few feet, flooding the car with the dying, blood-red light of the sunset. 3 figures stood silhouetted against the sky, their forms bulky and menacing. Before Eliza could even process the new terror, the cowboy moved. It wasn't a sudden jerk, but a fluid, deliberate motion. He didn't speak. He didn't even look down at her. One large, gloved hand simply pressed gently against her shoulder, a silent command to stay still, to be small. His other arm moved, shifting the duster so that it fell more completely over her, cocooning her in darkness. He leaned forward slightly, creating a deeper hollow for her to hide in, his body becoming a solid shield between her and the open door. The smell of dust and leather intensified, and she could feel the slow, steady beat of his heart against her ear. It was the calmest thing in her world. "Anything in here?" "Jed," a gruff voice called from outside. The man who stepped into the car was thick-set, with a florid face and a mustache stained with tobacco juice. His eyes, small and hard, scanned the gloomy interior. 2 others remained at the door, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. "Just a lone rider?" The man called Jed grunted, his gaze sweeping over the cowboy. His eyes lingered on the bulky shape under the duster. "What's your business?" The cowboy didn't answer immediately. He slowly turned his head, the brim of his hat keeping his face in shadow. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "My own—" Jed snorted. Taking another step inside, the floorboards creaked under his weight. "We're looking for someone. A girl. Ran off from Black Creek. Young. About 17, with hair the color of corn silk, scared rabbit eyes. You seen anyone like that?" Eliza held her breath until her lungs burned. Under the heavy fabric, she was certain they could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart. She pressed her face into the rough wool of the cowboy's shirt, praying for invisibility, for the earth to open up and swallow her whole. The cowboy shifted his weight just enough to be perceptible. A long, slow moment passed. She felt the muscles in his back tense slightly. "Just me and the dust in here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Been that way since Flagstaff." Jed was not convinced. He moved closer, his boots crunching on the sandy floor. He peered at the cowboy, trying to get a look under the hat. "You're a big fella. Got a lot of room under that coat." Eliza felt a tremor of pure fear run through her. This was it. He would poke at the coat with his boot, or worse, with the barrel of his gun. He would find her. But the cowboy did something unexpected. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He simply straightened his back a little, a subtle movement that somehow made him seem even larger, more immovable. He raised one hand and slowly, deliberately, pushed the brim of his hat up just an inch, enough to reveal the hard line of his jaw and eyes that were lost in the deep shadow but seemed to carry a weight of their own. "It's a cold wind," the cowboy said, his voice still quiet but carrying a new edge, a hint of steel beneath the gravel. "A man's got a right to keep warm." There was a challenge in the stillness of his posture, a warning in the calm of his voice that was more potent than any shouted threat. Jed hesitated. He looked from the silent cowboy to the empty corners of the car, then back again. The man wasn't afraid. He wasn't defensive. He was simply there, a fact, a piece of the landscape that would not be moved. For a long second, the only sounds were the howling wind and the clatter of the train. One of the men at the door grew impatient. "Ain't nothing here. Jed, let's check the next car. She's probably hiding with the livestock, where she belongs." Jed spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor, his eyes never leaving the cowboy. He seemed to be weighing his options, measuring the silent man before him. Whatever he saw, or didn't see, made him decide it wasn't worth the trouble. "All right," he grumbled, turning away. Waste of time. He stomped out of the car, followed by the other two. The door slid shut with a deafening bang, plunging the car back into near total darkness. The sound of their boots faded as they moved down the length of the train. Eliza stayed frozen, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. The cowboy remained perfectly still, a living statue of patience. He waited until the train had rattled over a crossing and the distant sound of a whistle echoed through the night. Only then did he relax, the tension leaving his shoulders in a slow, controlled release. The hand on her shoulder gave a gentle squeeze before retreating. He still didn't speak. The moment stretched, filled with the rumble of the wheels and the frantic beating of her own heart, which was slowly returning to a normal rhythm. She should move. She should thank him. But she couldn't. The terror had left her limbs feeling like lead, and the sudden, overwhelming relief was a dizzying wave that threatened to pull her under. She had been so close to being caught, so close to being dragged back to that gilded cage Abernathy called a home. This stranger, this silent man, had been the only thing standing between her and that fate. As if sensing her turmoil, he finally shifted. He leaned forward, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "They'll be back. They didn't believe me." His words, calm and certain, were a splash of cold water. The relief vanished, replaced by a fresh spike of fear. Of course they didn't believe him. They would come back, maybe with more men, and they wouldn't be so easily dissuaded a second time. What do we do?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. He was already moving. He stood up in one smooth motion, his height seeming to fill the small space. He reached down and took her arm, his grip firm but not rough, and pulled her to her feet. She stumbled, her legs unsteady. "Stay close," he commanded. It was the first direct order he'd given. He moved toward the main door they had just exited, his steps silent and sure-footed despite the swaying of the car. He slid it open just a crack, peering out into the rushing darkness. The landscape was a blur of gray rock and skeletal brush, illuminated by a sliver of moon. The wind tore at them, whipping Eliza's hair across her face and chilling her to the bone. The cowboy seemed to be watching for something, reading the land the way another man might read a book. He was looking at the way the ground fell away from the tracks, the curve of the rails up ahead, the speed of the train. He was calculating. He turned back to her. In the dim moonlight that filtered in, she could see his face for the first time. It was a strong face, weathered by sun and wind, with a square jaw and lines etched around his eyes. He wasn't handsome in the way of the men in town, but there was a deep-set solidity to him, a quiet competence that was more reassuring than any empty platitude. He pointed out into the darkness. "There, the track curves sharp, slows down for the grade. When I say, we jump." Jump. The word barely registered. Jump from a moving train into that maelstrom of rock and shadow madness. It was suicide. Her feet felt nailed to the floorboards. Her whole body screamed in protest. He saw the panic in her eyes. He didn't waste time with comforting words. He simply put a hand on the back of her neck, a gesture that was both steadying and commanding. "It's that or them," he said, his voice flat. "Your choice." He didn't have to say more. The image of Jed's leering face was enough. She gave a short, jerky nod. He turned his attention back to the landscape. "Get ready," he murmured. The train began to squeal and groan as it hit the beginning of the curve, its speed slackening just as he'd predicted. The world outside slowed from a wild blur to a lurching, discernible rush of sagebrush and stone. He slid the door open wider. The roar of the wind and the screech of the wheels filled the car. He wrapped a powerful arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. She was little more than a doll in his grasp. "Now," he said, and without another moment of hesitation, he launched them out into the night. The world was a violent, chaotic tumble of rock, sky, and stinging gravel. Eliza hit the ground with a force that drove the air from her lungs in a silent, painful gasp. The cowboy's body cushioned her, his solid frame absorbing the worst of the impact as they rolled down the steep, sandy embankment. Twigs and sharp-edged stones tore at her dress and scraped her skin, but his arm remained clamped around her waist, a band of iron holding her against him, protecting her head from the worst of the rocks. They came to a jarring halt in a thicket of dry sagebrush, the sharp, herbal scent filling her nostrils. For a moment, there was only the ringing in her ears and the agonizing fire in her chest as she fought to draw a breath. The train was already gone, its rhythmic clatter and mournful whistle fading into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert night. The cowboy shifted, disentangling himself from her with a low grunt. He was on his feet in an instant, a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky, already scanning the tracks they had just left behind. Eliza lay on the ground, a crumpled heap of calico and pain. Every part of her ached. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, a wave of dizziness washing over her. Her hands were raw. Her ankle throbbed with a sharp, insistent protest, and she could feel a warm trickle of blood from a cut on her cheek. But she was alive. She was free. The cowboy turned back to her. He didn't offer a hand, nor did he ask if she was hurt. His focus was absolute, his gaze fixed on the darkness down the tracks. They'll have seen the open door. They'll stop the train and come back. His voice was the same low, steady rumble, completely devoid of panic. It was a statement of fact, as unchangeable as the rising of the moon. We need to move, now. He started walking, his long strides eating up the uneven ground. He didn't look back to see if she was following. He expected it. For a second, rebellion flared in Eliza. She wanted to scream, to cry, to stay right where she was and let the desert swallow her. But the thought of Jed's face, of Abernathy's damp hands, was a spur that drove her to her feet. She choked back a sob of pain as she put weight on her injured ankle and hobbled after him. The small cloth sack with her mother's locket was still clutched in her hand, a small, hard knot of comfort. He led them away from the tracks, plunging into the labyrinth of shadows at the base of the mesas. The ground was treacherous, a minefield of loose scree that shifted and slid under her inadequate shoes. He moved with a quiet, uncanny grace, his boots seeming to find purchase where she found only instability. He was like a creature of this harsh land, while she was an intruder, clumsy and loud. They entered a narrow slit in the rock face, a canyon so tight that the walls seemed to lean in on them. The moonlight couldn't reach the bottom here, and they were plunged into a profound darkness. She could only follow the faint sound of his footsteps ahead and the dark shape of his back. Twice, her foot caught on a gnarled root or a displaced rock, sending her sprawling to her knees. The first time, a sharp cry of pain escaped her lips. The second, she bit it back, swallowing the taste of blood and dust. Each time, without a word, his hand would emerge from the darkness, his strong fingers closing around her arm, and he would haul her back to her feet with an efficient, impersonal strength. There was no gentleness in the gesture, but there was no impatience either. It was simply a necessary action, like righting a fallen post. He would release her, and they would continue on. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through the dark, he stopped. The canyon had widened slightly here, and a patch of dry, brittle bunch grass and tumbleweeds had collected against one wall. He knelt down, pulling a small oilskin pouch from an inside pocket of his duster. From it, he took a piece of flint and a small steel striker. Eliza watched, her breath coming in ragged pants, as he struck them together with a practiced motion. A shower of sparks fell into the tinder he had gathered. A tiny orange ember glowed, and he blew on it gently, coaxing it to life. A small flame flickered, then caught with a sudden whoosh, racing through the dry vegetation. Within seconds, a thick column of acrid, gray smoke was billowing upwards, clinging to the canyon walls and obscuring the sliver of sky above. The fire illuminated his face, carving it out of the darkness. The planes of his cheeks were stark, his jaw set, and his eyes, visible for the first time in the flickering light, were a pale, clear gray, as watchful and remote as a hawk's. He watched the smoke for a moment, judging its density and direction. "It will drift back toward the tracks," he said, more to himself than to her. "They'll think we went that way. It'll buy us time." He stamped out the edges of the fire, ensuring it wouldn't spread, and then turned back into the darkness. The brief illusion of warmth and light was gone, and the cold, oppressive dark felt even deeper than before. He took her arm again, but this time his grip was different. He didn't let go. He kept his hand on her elbow, guiding her, steadying her as they moved deeper into the winding maze of rock. The next hours blurred into a waking nightmare of exhaustion and pain. Her ankle was a ball of fire, and every step was an agony. The initial adrenaline of the escape had long since worn off, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness that was heavier than any physical burden. She stopped thinking, stopped feeling anything but the throbbing in her foot and the solid presence of the man guiding her. His silence became a strange sort of companion. It wasn't an empty silence. It was a weighted, watchful stillness. It was the silence of the mountains, of the ancient, patient land itself. She began to trust it. She leaned on him, letting him take some of her weight, and followed his lead without question. He was her only compass in the disorienting dark. She didn't know how long they walked. The moon climbed higher, then began its slow descent, and the stars wheeled across the narrow strip of sky visible above the canyon walls. She saw the dark shapes of cholla cacti, their spines glinting like needles in the faint light. She heard the distant, lonely cry of a coyote, a sound that made her flinch and press closer to his side. He didn't react at all. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that her legs would simply fold beneath her and leave her for the buzzards. The canyon opened up. They emerged from the tight rock walls into a small, hidden valley, a bowl of land cradled by the surrounding mesas. The air here was cooler, and she could smell the faint, sweet scent of water and growing things. A gentle stream, little more than a trickle, wound its way through the center of the valley, its surface glittering like a string of scattered diamonds under the moonlight. And there, nestled in the protective curve of the valley wall, was a house. It wasn't much, a small, sturdy cabin built of rough-hewn timber and thick adobe mud, with a low, sloping roof and a single stone chimney from which a lazy curl of white smoke was rising, a ghostly banner in the night air. A soft, yellow light glowed from a single window, a beacon of impossible warmth and safety in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. A simple corral stood nearby, its posts dark against the pale ground. Though she could see no horses within it, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. The sight of it broke the last of her strength. Her legs gave way completely, and she would have crumpled to the ground if he hadn't been holding her. This time, he didn't just pull her up. He shifted his grip, sliding one arm securely around her back and the other under her knees, and lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. A small, involuntary sound escaped her lips, a sigh that was part pain, part protest, and part overwhelming relief. She was suddenly acutely aware of the closeness of him. She could feel the hard, lean muscle of his chest through his dusty shirt, feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heart beating against her own frantic pulse. He smelled of smoke, sweat, and clean earth. She turned her face into the rough canvas of his duster, hiding from the strangeness of it all, and closed her eyes. He carried her the last 100 yards across the valley floor, his steps even and unhurried. The soft crunch of his boots on the dry soil was the only sound. As they approached the cabin, the wooden door creaked open. A figure was silhouetted in the warm light from within. For a terrifying moment, she thought they had been followed, that this was a trap, but this figure was small, no bigger than a child. The cowboy stopped on the rough porch and gently set her down, keeping a hand on her arm to steady her as her feet touched the solid wood. Her legs trembled like a newborn foal's. She looked up and saw that the figure in the doorway was a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with a mop of unruly blonde hair and wide, serious eyes. He was holding a flickering oil lamp, which cast long, dancing shadows around them. The cowboy rested a hand on the boy's head, a gesture of quiet affection that seemed startlingly at odds with the hardened man who had just dragged her through the desert. "It's all right, Tom," the cowboy said. His voice, when speaking to the child, had lost some of its gravelly edge, softening into something almost gentle. "Go on back inside. Get a blanket." The boy, Tom, stared at Eliza, his gaze unwavering and unnervingly perceptive. He looked at her torn dress, her scratched face, and the exhaustion that was etched into every line of her body. He said nothing, simply nodded at the cowboy's words, turned, and disappeared back into the warm light of the cabin. The cowboy looked down at her. His face was in shadow again, his hat obscuring his expression, but she felt his gaze on her. "You're safe here," he said, and the simple words carried the weight of an unbreakable promise. He nudged the door open wider and gestured for her to go inside, leaning heavily on the door frame. Eliza took a limping, painful step across the threshold, out of the cold, dangerous night and into the small circle of light and warmth. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around Eliza like a physical embrace, a stark contrast to the biting wind of the high desert. It was a single, large room, the heart of which was a wide stone hearth where a low fire crackled and spat, casting flickering orange light on the rough-hewn log walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, brewing coffee, and something savory simmering in a black iron pot over the flames. It was the scent of a home, a scent she hadn't realized she had so desperately missed. The space was simple, built for survival rather than comfort. A long, sturdy table made of a single slab of wood stood in the center of the room with 2 benches on either side. In one corner, a pallet of thick blankets and furs served as a bed. In another, shelves were stacked with tins, sacks of flour and beans, and other dry goods. Everything was clean, ordered, and had the unmistakable look of being well used but well cared for. There were no frills, no lace curtains or painted china, only the bare necessities of life, and yet it felt more like a sanctuary than any place she had ever known. The cowboy, the man who had pulled her from the jaws of a terrible fate, followed her inside, closing the heavy plank door behind them and shutting out the vast, lonely night. The sound of the bolt sliding into place was a note of finality, of safety, that made Eliza's frayed nerves tremble with relief. The boy, Tom, reappeared from a shadowed corner, dragging a heavy wool blanket. He approached her without a word and held it out with both hands. His expression was solemn, his wide blue eyes taking in her disheveled state with an unnerving intensity. She reached out with a trembling hand and took the blanket, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm. The blanket was coarse and heavy, smelling faintly of wood smoke and the outdoors. She pulled it around her shoulders, the simple weight of it a profound comfort. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a dry, cracked thing. Tom didn't reply. He just continued to stare at her. The cowboy moved past them toward the fire, his spurs making a soft, jingling sound on the packed earth floor. He picked up a ladle and stirred the contents of the pot, sending a fresh, fragrant steam of beef and wild onions into the air. He did this without looking at her, giving her space, allowing her to acclimate to the light and the warmth. Eliza felt a crippling sense of awkwardness, of being an unwelcome intrusion. She was a stray, brought in from the storm, her filth and her fear staining the quiet peace of this small home. She stood frozen just inside the door, huddled in the blanket, unsure of where to go or what to do. Her ankle throbbed in time with the frantic beating of her heart. She was acutely aware of her torn dress, the grime on her skin, the wild tangle of her hair. She instinctively pressed herself back against the rough wood of the door, trying to melt into the shadows. to take up as little space as possible. The cowboy turned from the fire. He had taken off his hat, and in the full light of the lamp, she could see him clearly. His hair was dark brown, thick and a little long, and streaked with lighter strands from the sun. The lines on his face were deeper than she'd thought. Fanning out from the corners of his pale gray eyes, the lines of a man who spent his life squinting into the sun and assessing distant horizons. He was not old, perhaps 30, but his face held the gravity of a much older man. He looked at her, then his gaze dropped to her foot, which she was holding awkwardly off the floor. He gestured with his head toward one of the benches at the table. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a harsh command, but a simple statement of what needed to happen next. She obeyed, limping over to the bench and sinking down onto the hard wood. Pulling the blanket tighter around her, he disappeared for a moment into the darker corner of the cabin and returned with a wooden basin of water and a strip of clean-looking cloth. He placed them on the floor in front of her. He then took a small tin from one of the shelves and set it down as well, a salve of some kind. He knelt in front of her, not on two knees like a man in prayer, but in a low, practical crouch. He looked at her ankle, which was already swollen and discolored in the lamplight. He didn't touch her. He simply looked up at her face, a silent question in his eyes. He was waiting for permission. Tears pricked at the back of her eyes. This simple courtesy, this quiet respect for her person after she had been treated like a piece of property, was almost more than she could bear. She gave a tiny, jerky nod. His hands were as she had imagined them, large, calloused, and surprisingly gentle. He carefully worked her worn shoe off, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. When her bare foot was exposed, he probed the swelling with a light touch. She winced, drawing a sharp breath through her teeth. "It's a sprain, not broken," he announced, his voice low. He dipped the cloth into the basin of cool water and began to clean the dirt and gravel from the scrapes on her foot and ankle. The water was a blessed relief against her hot, aching skin. He worked in silence, his focus entirely on the task. While he tended to her foot, Tom, who had been watching the entire proceeding from his post by the hearth, finally spoke. His voice was as clear and artless as a spring morning, but his words landed with the force of a stone. "Are you a ghost?" he asked, his head tilted to one side. Eliza's head snapped up. She looked at the boy, startled. He wasn't being cruel. His tone was one of genuine, scientific curiosity. He took a step closer, his eyes examining her pale, scratched face. "Your face is all sad, like a person who drowned." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Eliza didn't know what to say. The boy's words were a brutal, honest mirror. She did feel like a ghost, a hollowed-out shell of the girl she had been. She felt like she had drowned in her father's debts, in Abernathy's greed, in the terror of the chase. There was no answer she could give that felt true. It was the cowboy who broke the spell. He didn't look up from his work, but a small, almost imperceptible sound came from him, not quite a chuckle, but the low rumble of one. "Tom," he said, his voice flat but carrying an undercurrent of admonishment. "That's no way to talk to a guest." "Is she a guest?" Tom asked, his logic unassailable. "Is she staying?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Was she staying? She had no right to stay. She was a burden, a danger. The men from the train were still out there somewhere. They could bring trouble to this quiet valley, to this man and his boy. The thought sent a fresh wave of shame and fear through her. She was a harbinger of violence, and she had brought it to the one place that had offered her sanctuary. The cowboy finished cleaning her ankle and opened the small tin. The salve inside was dark and smelled sharply of pine and herbs. He applied it carefully to her scrapes, his touch methodical and sure. Then he took another strip of cloth and began to wrap her ankle, binding it with a practiced efficiency that suggested he had done this many times before. "The boy ain't mine," he said suddenly, his voice quiet, as if he were answering a question she hadn't dared to ask. He kept his eyes on his work, his hands never faltering. Found him in Prescott. His folks caught the cholera. He was just left. The simple, unadorned story was more heartbreaking than any embellished tale. Just left, like a piece of unwanted baggage. Eliza looked at Tom, who was now poking the fire with a stick, seemingly oblivious, but she saw the tension in his small shoulders. He had heard. He knew they were talking about him. She looked at the man kneeling before her, this silent, solitary cowboy who had taken in a lost child, who had shielded a desperate stranger under his coat, who had jumped from a moving train and carried her to this hidden place. He was a man of deep, quiet currents, his kindness expressed not in words but in solid, irrefutable actions. He finished wrapping her ankle and finally looked up at her, his pale gray eyes meeting hers. "My name is Silas," he said.
"Eliza,"
she managed to whisper. He gave a slow nod, as if committing the name to memory. Then he stood, his knees cracking softly. "There's stew. You should eat." He moved back to the hearth, leaving her on the bench. Tom abandoned his stick and scrambled to the table, his earlier solemnity vanishing, replaced by the simple, urgent hunger of a child. He grabbed a wooden bowl and a spoon. Silas filled a bowl for the boy, then one for himself. He hesitated for a second, then filled a third bowl and placed it on the table across from Tom, an unspoken invitation for Eliza to join them. She should have been starving. She hadn't eaten since the morning of the day before, and then it had only been a dry piece of bread. But her stomach was a tight, hard knot of fear and exhaustion. The thought of food was nauseating. Still, she knew it would be an insult to refuse. It was an offering, another small, practical kindness she could not bring herself to reject. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself up from the bench and hobbled to the table, using the rough wood for support. She sat down opposite the boy, pulling the blanket around her like a shield. She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled so much that the spoon rattled against the side of the bowl. The stew was thick with meat and vegetables, and it was hot enough to scald her tongue, but she barely tasted it. She ate mechanically, forcing each spoonful down, aware of the two sets of eyes on her. Silas ate in the same way he did everything else, with a quiet, efficient purpose. Tom, on the other hand, ate with a boy's noisy gusto, occasionally glancing at Eliza with open curiosity. The silence in the cabin was no longer comfortable. It was filled with the weight of everything unsaid, every question unasked. Eliza felt like a specimen under glass, a strange creature brought into their world. She finished half the stew and put her spoon down, her stomach refusing to accept any more. She sat with her hands wrapped around the warm bowl, a castaway clinging to a piece of driftwood. She didn't belong here. As soon as her ankle was strong enough to bear her weight, she would have to leave. She couldn't endanger them. It was a bleak, lonely thought. The world outside this small cabin was vast and filled with men like Jed and Abernathy. There was no place for her. The little flicker of hope she had felt upon seeing the warm light of the cabin began to dim, replaced by the cold certainty of her predicament. She was just as lost as she had been on the train, perhaps even more so. Before, she had been running from something. Now, she had found a place she couldn't stay, a place she didn't deserve, and she had nowhere left to run. The drowning feeling returned, a cold tide rising in her chest. Eliza woke to a world of gray and silver. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing light that did little to push back the pre-dawn chill. For a confusing moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling above her was made of rough, dark logs, not the smooth plaster of her room back home. The air was cold and clean, tinged with the scent of pine smoke, not the stale, perfumed air of the Abernathy house. She was lying on a pallet of furs that smelled of dust and animal, a heavy wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Then it all came rushing back in a dizzying, sickening wave: the flight, the train, the hot breath of the desert wind, the jump into darkness, the silent man named Silas. She sat up with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs. Her ankle gave a sharp, protesting throb, reminding her that the nightmare had been real. She was alone in the main room. The cabin was still and silent, save for the soft sigh of the embers. A sliver of pale light was beginning to outline the edges of the single window. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Silas was nowhere to be seen. The small cot in the corner where Tom had presumably slept was also empty, the blankets folded neatly at its foot. A knot of panic tightened in her stomach. Had they left her? Had they decided she was too much trouble and slipped away in the night? She pushed the heavy blanket aside and tried to stand. The pain in her ankle was a dull, angry ache, but it held her weight. Limping heavily, she made her way to the door. Her hand hesitated on the iron latch. What if they had locked her in? But the bolt slid back smoothly, and the door swung inward on silent, well-oiled hinges. The cold air that met her was sharp and clean, a shock to her system that cleared the last of the sleep from her head. She stepped onto the small porch and drew in a deep breath. The valley, which had been a place of shadows and imagined terrors the night before, was now revealed in the soft, pearlescent light of dawn. It was more beautiful and more isolated than she could have imagined. The mesas that ringed the small hollow were painted in shades of lavender and rose by the approaching sun, their stark rock faces softened by the morning mist that clung to their bases. The small stream she had barely noticed last night gurgled nearby, its water clear and cold-looking. The world felt new, as if it had just been washed clean. There was no sign of the dusty, violent world she had fled. Here, there was only a profound and overwhelming peace. She saw Silas then. He was down by the corral, his back to her, moving with the same unhurried, economical grace she had observed in the dark. He was mending a split rail, his movements fluid and precise, a thin curl of his breath plumed in the cold air. He didn't seem to have noticed her. He was completely absorbed in his work, a part of the quiet morning landscape. Not knowing what else to do, Eliza remained on the porch, a silent observer. She felt like a ghost, just as the boy had said, a restless spirit haunting the edges of this self-contained world. She didn't belong. The peace of this valley was not for her. She was a disruption, a loose thread that threatened to unravel the simple, sturdy fabric of their lives. The urge to turn and run, to limp back into the wilderness and disappear, was a powerful, bitter taste in her mouth. But where would she go? Her ankle would not carry her far, and the desert was a patient killer. Her gaze fell on the small, swept earth yard in front of the cabin. It was tidy, but the wind from the night before had scattered leaves and dust across its surface. Beside the door, propped against the log wall, was a rough broom made of bound twigs. An idea, a need, began to form in her mind. It was a desperate, grasping instinct for purpose. She couldn't mend a fence or hunt for food. She couldn't offer protection, but she could sweep a floor. She could perform the small, familiar tasks that had once structured her days. Moving slowly, trying not to put too much weight on her injured foot, she retrieved the broom. The handle was smooth and worn from use. It felt solid and real in her hands. She started at one end of the porch, her movement stiff and awkward at first. The simple, repetitive motion of sweeping was a strange comfort. Back and forth, back and forth. The twig bristles scratching softly against the packed dirt. It was a rhythm, a small piece of order she could impose on a world that had spun into chaos. This was something she knew how to do, at her father's farm, before it was lost to the cards. Sweeping the porch had been her first chore of the day. It was a task she had performed 1,000 times, her hands moving from a memory deeper than thought. As she worked, a small corner of her mind began to relax. The constant, thrumming anxiety that had been her companion for days receded just a little. She focused on the task, on the growing pile of dust and leaves, on the clean, dark earth she was revealing beneath. She wasn't Eliza, the runaway, the hunted girl. She was just a woman with a broom, bringing a small patch of the world into order. The sun crested the eastern mesa, spilling golden light into the valley, and the air began to lose its sharpest chill. The light touched her face, and it felt like a benediction. When she had finished the yard, she saw a small, low structure behind the cabin that she hadn't noticed before, a chicken coop. A faint, familiar clucking sound came from within, drawn by another echo of her past life. She limped toward it. The coop was as sturdy and practical as the main cabin, and inside, a half-dozen hens scratched and fussed in the straw, in the nesting boxes. She saw the smooth, pale brown shapes of fresh eggs. She found a small woven basket hanging on a nail inside the coop's door. Carefully, so as not to startle the hens, she began to gather the eggs. The warmth of a newly laid egg in the palm of her hand was a miracle of life and heat. It was another simple, tangible thing, a connection to a cycle of living that had nothing to do with fear or flight. She gathered 5 eggs, placing them gently in the basket. She felt a pang of longing for her own small flock, for the familiar routines of a life that no longer existed, but the feeling was followed by a quiet, surprising sense of gratitude, for the warmth of the sun, for the solid weight of the eggs in the basket, for the simple fact that she was here, alive, and not in Abernathy's clutches. When she turned to leave the coop, she found Tom standing in the doorway, watching her. He was fully dressed in patched trousers and a collarless shirt, his blonde hair sticking up in every direction. He said nothing, his blue eyes simply following her every move. "Good morning," Eliza said softly, her voice still a little hoarse. Tom just stared at the basket. "Are you making breakfast?" he asked. It wasn't a hopeful question, just a factual one. I can," she found herself saying, surprised by her own words. "If you'd like." He gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, as if the outcome was of little consequence to him, and then turned and walked back toward the cabin. Eliza followed slowly, the basket of eggs held carefully in front of her. When she entered the cabin, the fire had been built up and a pot of coffee was bubbling on the hearth, filling the room with a rich, dark aroma. Silas was at the table, cleaning a rifle, his movements economical and precise. He looked up as she came in, his gray eyes glancing at the basket of eggs and then at her face. He didn't smile. His expression remained as unreadable as ever, but he gave a slight nod of acknowledgement before returning his attention to his weapon. The moment was thick with unspoken things. She didn't know the rules of this house, didn't know her place in it. Was she overstepping? Was this expected of her? Her uncertainty must have shown on her face. She stood hesitating in the middle of the room, feeling as awkward and out of place as she had the night before. But her body seemed to know what to do, even if her mind did not. She saw a cast-iron skillet hanging from a hook by the hearth. She saw a slab of bacon wrapped in cloth on one of the shelves. She found plates and forks stacked neatly. Without a conscious decision, she set the basket down and began to prepare a meal. She sliced the bacon and set it to fry in the skillet, the familiar sizzle and smell filling the small cabin. She cracked the eggs, her hands moving with an old, ingrained skill. Tom sat on the bench, watching her every move, while Silas continued to methodically clean his rifle. The soft click and scrape of metal on metal a counterpoint to the sizzle of the frying bacon. No one spoke. It wasn't a hostile silence, but it was a deep one, the silence of people accustomed to their own company. A silence Eliza was afraid to break. She worked, focusing on the simple tasks, letting the rhythm of the work calm her nerves. She folded the dish towels that were drying by the fire, her hands smoothing the rough fabric, creating neat, comforting squares. It felt good to be useful, to do something other than run and hide and be afraid. When the bacon was crisp and the eggs were fried, she slid them onto 3 tin plates. She looked at the table. Silas had set out 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 tin cups. He had already poured coffee for himself. She stood there, holding the third plate, the one for herself, and a wave of despair washed over her. Of course, there were only two of them. She was the intruder, the extra mouth, the complication. She had assumed. She had imposed. The food she held suddenly felt like stolen goods. She was about to put the plate aside, to murmur an apology and retreat back into the shadows, when Silas looked up. He seemed to read the conflict on her face in an instant. His hands, which had been moving over the rifle, stilled. He looked at the two place settings, then at the plate in her hand. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, in one deliberate motion, he reached out, picked up a third cup from the shelf behind him, and placed it on the table. He followed it with a third fork, laying it neatly beside the cup. He didn't look at her. He just moved the coffee pot to the center of the table and then went back to his rifle, as if the matter was settled. It was a small thing, a cup, a fork, but to Eliza, it was everything. It was permission. It was acceptance. It was a place at the table. A hot, sharp pressure built behind her eyes, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying. She quickly set the plate down at the place he had made for her and turned back to the fire, fussing with the skillet to hide her face. She had swept his yard, gathered his eggs, cooked his food, and in return, he had set her a place at his table. It wasn't a promise of permanent safety, not a declaration of friendship. It was a simple, unspoken acknowledgement of her presence, an offering of shared sustenance for one more day. In the silent, lonely world of the high desert, it was more than enough. It was a beginning. The breakfast was a quiet affair, a meal eaten with the shared, unspoken understanding of survivors. Tom ate with a child's focused intensity, chasing the last bits of egg around his plate with a piece of cornbread. Silas ate slowly, his gaze distant, as if he were listening to sounds only he could hear from the valley outside. Eliza barely tasted her food, but the warmth of the coffee in her hands and the solid presence of the two opposite her began to thaw a piece of the ice that had been lodged in her heart for days. When they were finished, Tom, without being asked, scraped the leftovers from the plates into a wooden bowl for a dog she hadn't yet seen, and then disappeared out the door, his bare feet making soft slapping sounds on the porch before vanishing into the bright morning. A moment later, she heard his high, clear voice as he chased a lizard through the sagebrush. The silence he left behind was different. It was heavier, more adult. Eliza stood and began to gather the tin plates. It was a movement born of instinct, of a lifetime spent cleaning up after men. Silas didn't stop her. He simply watched her for a moment before pushing his bench back and moving to a corner of the cabin where a worn leather saddle rested on a stand. He began to work, his hands moving with a familiar grace as he applied a dark, rich-smelling oil to the dry, cracked leather. Eliza carried the plates to a basin on a dry sink near the door. She found a block of harsh yellow lye soap and a rough cloth. She poured water from a bucket, her movements slow and deliberate. The water was cool, and the simple, domestic act of washing the dishes was a balm to her shattered nerves. The scrape of the cloth against the tin, the scent of the soap, the feeling of the water on her raw hands, it was all real, all blessedly normal in a world that had become a waking nightmare. She washed in silence, her back to him. She could hear the soft squeak of the oiled leather as he worked the conditioner into it. A steady, rhythmic sound. She knew he was there, a solid, watchful presence. But his silence wasn't demanding. It was patient. It was the silence of the mesas, waiting for the sun and the rain, passing no judgment. It was a silence she felt, for the first time she might be able to fill. The words came out before she had even decided to speak them. A quiet, ragged whisper aimed at her own wavering reflection in the murky dishwater. "My father, he wasn't always a bad man." She stopped scrubbing, her hands still in the water. She could feel Silas's movements behind her pause for a fraction of a second before resuming their steady rhythm. He didn't speak, didn't turn around. He was giving her the space to continue, or to stop. She took a shaky breath and went on. the story tumbling out in a low, halting flow, as if she were pulling a long, tangled thread from deep inside her. Before my mother passed, we had a good farm, north of here. There was a creek and cottonwood trees that turned yellow in the fall. He was a good man then. He'd laugh. His laugh was so loud it would startle the chickens. After the fever took her, something in him broke. The silence in the house. It was too much for him to bear. So he started going into town, first just for company, then for the cards. She scrubbed at a plate that was already clean, the motion mechanical, her eyes seeing not the tin but the faded floral wallpaper of her father's house, the way the dust had gathered on her mother's things. He lost the farm first, said it was a run of bad luck. Then he lost the horses. He kept saying his luck was about to turn, but it never did. We moved into a small house at the edge of town, and I took in sewing to keep us fed. But his debts, they were like a shadow that just kept growing, darker and darker, until it swallowed everything. The squeaking of the leather stopped. She knew, without turning, that he was listening with his whole being. The man he owed the most to. His name is Abernathy. He owns the biggest saloon in Black Creek. A big man, with a soft body and hands that always looked damp. He smelled of stale cigars and whiskey that had gone sour. She shuddered, a tremor that ran all the way from her shoulders to her hands, sloshing the water in the basin. He started coming to the house. He'd bring my father a bottle and they would talk, but he would be looking at me. Not like you look at a person, like you look at a horse you're thinking of buying, measuring, calculating. She set the plate down and picked up another, her knuckles white where she gripped its edge. A week ago, my father told me, Abernathy had made him an offer. He would forgive all the debts. He would give my father a stipend, enough to live on. In exchange, her voice broke, and she had to stop to swallow the lump in her throat. In exchange for me, he called it a marriage, a respectable union. Mr. Abernathy is 50 years old. Silas, he has buried 2 wives already. My father, he called it a blessing, an answer to his prayers. She could feel the shame of it like a hot brand on her skin, the shame of being sold, and the deeper, more terrible shame of being sold by her own father. They didn't ask me. They told me. The wedding was to be yesterday. Abernathy gave me a ring. It was heavy and cold, gold, with a chip of blue stone in it. He put it on my finger himself. His hands were just as I imagined, soft and damp. She rubbed her bare ring finger with her thumb, the memory so vivid she could almost feel the cold weight of the metal. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just sat on my bed, and I could hear them in the next room, my father and him, laughing and drinking, toasting my health, my future. And I knew I couldn't do it. I would rather die in the desert than let that man, than be his wife. I thought of my mother. I thought of what she would say. She would have told me to run. Her voice grew stronger now, fueled by the memory of her own desperate resolve. Abernathy was careless with his drink. He left his coat on a chair. I knew he kept his money in it, and in a lockbox in his room at the saloon. That's where he kept the money he'd set aside for my dowry. It felt like a fever dream. I waited until my father had passed out. I slipped out of the house. I went to the saloon. The back door was unlocked for the cleaning woman. I found the box, I took the money, and I took the ring Abernathy had given me. It felt right. It felt like I was taking back the price they had put on me. She finally turned from the basin, her hands dripping water onto the floor. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time since she had started her story, he had stopped working. He was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, the rifle now resting beside him. His gray eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable but intensely focused. He wasn't pitying her. He was seeing her. "I ran," she said, her gaze holding his. "I ran all night until I reached the rail line. I saw the freight train slowing for the water tower, and I just climbed on. I didn't know where it was going. I just knew it was going away. The men on the train, they were his men. He would have discovered I was gone by morning. The money, the ring. It wasn't just about getting me back. It was about his pride. He couldn't let a girl like me make a fool of him. She had laid her whole, pathetic story at his feet. The ugliness of it, the desperation, the theft. She expected to see disgust in his eyes, or maybe just a weary sort of judgment. She was trouble. She was a thief. She was a burden he had been saddled with. But his expression didn't change. He just continued to watch her. His silence a vast, empty space that she now felt compelled to fill with her deepest, most raw fear. She looked down at her own 2 hands, turning them over in the air. They were red and chapped from the lye soap, but they were clean. They were her own. "I'm still a maiden," she said, the words so quiet they were almost swallowed by the vastness of the cabin. She wasn't confessing it to him as much as she was reminding herself, clinging to one last piece of her old identity, one last thing that hadn't been taken or sold. She lifted her eyes to his again, and the final, desperate question of her heart spilled out. "But I don't know what that means in this land anymore." The question hung between them, fragile and terrible. What was the value of her virtue in a world that had tried to sell it for a gambling debt? What was the meaning of innocence in a place where survival was a daily, brutal fight? It was a currency she had been taught to prize above all others. And yet out here, it felt like a useless, heavy coin in the pocket of a starving woman. Silas pushed himself off the wall. He walked not towards her, but towards the hearth. He picked up the coffee pot, his movements as deliberate and unhurried as ever. He came back to the table and poured the last of the dark, steaming liquid into his cup. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, looking down into the cup as if the answer to her question might be found in the black depths. Eliza braced herself for his reply, for a platitude, perhaps, or worse, for a dismissal. For him to tell her that out here, it meant nothing at all, that it was a weakness, a liability she would have to shed to survive. When he finally turned, he didn't have an answer. He had a simple, undeniable fact. He looked at her, and his gaze was as clear and steady as the desert sky after a storm. "Here," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to settle the very dust motes in the air. "It means you belong to yourself." He didn't say anything more. He didn't have to. The words landed in the shattered center of her, not as a comfort, but as a foundation. Belong to yourself. In all her life, she had belonged to her father. She had been about to belong to Abernathy. The idea of belonging to no one but herself was so radical, so terrifying, and so profoundly liberating that she couldn't breathe. It wasn't about what she was or wasn't. It was about who she answered to. And in this small, hidden valley, in the quiet presence of this silent man, the answer, for the first time in her life, was no one, just herself. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm, as steady and predictable as the sun's journey across the vast, blue canvas of the sky. Eliza's ankle healed, the sharp pain dulling to a persistent ache, and with her returning mobility came a deeper immersion into the life of the small, hidden valley. She did not ask if she could stay. He did not tell her she had to leave. Her presence became a simple fact, like the gurgle of the stream or the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Her hands, once softened by needlework, grew calloused from pulling weeds in the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, from scrubbing pots with sand from the creek, from kneading dough for their daily bread. She learned the small routines that governed their lives, the way Silas rose before the sun to tend to his 2 horses, a pair of sturdy mustangs he kept in the corral, the way Tom would sit for an hour every morning with a tattered primer, painstakingly tracing letters while Silas watched, his lips moving silently along with the boys, the way the afternoon heat would settle in the valley, driving them all to the shade of the porch in a sleepy, shared silence. She learned about the man, Silas, not through words, but through observation. She saw the way he could gentle a nervous horse with a low murmur and a steady hand. She watched him track a rabbit for their dinner. His movements so economical and quiet, he seemed to melt into the landscape. She saw the way his eyes, which seemed so hard and distant, would soften when he looked at Tom. A fleeting expression of fierce, protective tenderness that was more powerful than any spoken declaration of love. He was a man carved from the silence and solitude of the land, his emotions buried deep, emerging only in small, practical acts of care. He never spoke of his past, and she never asked. They were two solitary souls, each with a history they did not wish to disturb, finding a strange and unexpected solace in the shared quiet. Tom, for his part, slowly shed his initial solemnity. He began to treat Eliza as a permanent fixture, a new and interesting feature of his small world. He would bring her things he found on his explorations, a smooth, gray river stone, a hawk's feather, a strangely shaped piece of driftwood, and present them to her without comment, his face a mask of serious concentration. He would sometimes sit beside her while she mended their clothes, watching the needle flash in and out of the rough fabric, his questions a constant, innocent barrage. "Why is the sky blue? Where does the sun go at night? Did you have a To this last question, she simply answered, "Yes, I did," and the boy, sensing a boundary he should not cross, fell silent and did not ask again. It was in the evenings that the fragile sense of family was most palpable. After the work of the day was done, they would gather around the long wooden table as the cool desert air descended into the valley. The fire would crackle in the hearth. The oil lamp would cast a warm, golden glow on their faces, and the vast, star-dusted silence of the wilderness would press in around their small cabin, making it feel like the only inhabited place in the world. On one such evening, a week after her arrival, Eliza served a stew she had made from rabbit and wild herbs. It was a simple meal, but she had taken pride in it, a small contribution to the household that sustained them all. Tom was ravenous, as usual, his spoon moving in a steady rhythm from bowl to mouth. Silas ate with his customary quiet focus, but she saw him take a second helping, a small, unspoken compliment that made a warmth bloom in her chest. The cabin was filled with the comfortable, domestic sounds of spoons scraping against tin, the soft crackle of the fire, the distant chirping of crickets, a sense of peace, so profound it was almost painful, settled over Eliza. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the knot of fear in her stomach had loosened. She felt safe. It was into this quiet contentment that Tom dropped his question, his clear, piping voice cutting through the silence with the innocent force of a thrown rock. "Are you going to stay here forever?" He wasn't looking at Eliza. He was looking at Silas, his spoon halfway to his mouth, his wide blue eyes demanding a simple, factual answer to a question he saw as entirely practical. The air in the room instantly changed. The fragile piece shattered, the pieces falling around them like shards of glass. The question, so simple from the mouth of a child, was a brutal reminder of Eliza's precarious position. Forever, she had no concept of forever. She had been living one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, too terrified to look any further ahead. But the boy's question forced her to. It held up a mirror to her reality. She was a guest, a stray, a temporary resident whose time could run out at any moment. A cold dread crept up her spine. She could feel Silas's stillness beside her. He hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, but the weight of his silence was suddenly immense. She was an outsider, a complication, a woman with a dangerous past that could, at any moment, come crashing down upon this quiet, hidden place. She didn't belong here forever. She didn't belong here at all. All her work, all the small routines she had built, suddenly felt like a child playing house, a pathetic attempt to build a home on a foundation of sand. She could not look at Silas. She stared down at her own hands, clasped tightly in her lap. The hope that had begun to take root in her heart withered under the harsh glare of the boy's question. She had to know. She couldn't continue to live in this state of suspended animation. this fragile dream that could be broken at any moment. Slowly, she lifted her head. She turned her gaze from the boy to the man beside her. She didn't ask the boy's question. She asked her own, the one that lay at the very core of her fear and her shame, the question that had been haunting her since she'd confessed her story to him. Her voice was a low, trembling thing, barely more than a whisper, but in the sudden, absolute silence of the cabin, it rang as loud as a bell. "Are you sure?" she began, her eyes pleading with his for an answer he might not be able to give. "That a maiden like me has a place here." She used the old-fashioned word deliberately. Maiden. It was the word her father had used, the word that defined her value in the world she had fled. It was the mark of her purity, the very thing that Abernathy had sought to purchase. But here, in this raw, unsentimental land, in the presence of this solitary, practical man, she feared it was just the opposite, a mark of weakness, a symbol of her softness, her inexperience, her unsuitability for a life that demanded hardness and resilience above all else. She was asking if her innocence, the very thing she had run to protect, had made her unfit for the only sanctuary she had found. Silas looked at her. The firelight flickered in his pale gray eyes, and for a long, agonizing moment, she could read nothing in them. He looked from her face to Tom, who was now watching them both, his childish curiosity replaced by a dim understanding that something of great importance was happening. Then his gaze returned to Eliza. The silence stretched, pulling taut, and she felt her last vestiges of hope begin to fray. He was going to say no. He was going to tell her, kindly perhaps, that she couldn't stay, that she was too much of a risk, too different, too fragile. He didn't speak. Instead, he moved, slowly, deliberately. He reached his right hand across the small space between them on the wooden bench. His hand was not the soft, damp hand of Mr. Abernathy, nor the weak, trembling hand of her father. It was the hand of a man who worked. It was broad and deeply tanned, the knuckles scarred, the palm and fingers covered in a thick layer of calluses from his work with rope and wood and iron. It was a hand that knew its own strength. She watched, mesmerized, as it moved through the air. She thought he might say something, might make a gesture of dismissal, but his hand came to rest gently over her own, where it was clenched into a tight, white-knuckled fist on the table. He didn't grasp her hand. He didn't squeeze it. He simply covered it. The effect was electric, a shock that went straight to her core. The roughness of his skin was a startling contrast to the frantic, panicked pulse she could feel beating in her wrist. But beneath the roughness, there was a deep, steady warmth, a heat that seemed to seep from his calluses directly into her skin, flowing up her arm and spreading through her chest, melting the ice that had been there for so long. It was a touch devoid of demand or possession. It was solid. It was grounding. It was a physical anchor in a world that had threatened to sweep her away. He held her gaze, his gray eyes clear and unwavering, and in that simple, profound gesture, he gave her his answer. The touch was more eloquent than any speech, more binding than any promise spoken aloud. It was a silent, solemn vow that bypassed the need for words entirely. The warmth that spread through her was not just physical. It was a deep, soul-settling heat of relief so profound it made her want to weep. She felt the tension drain out of her shoulders, felt the fist of her hand unclench beneath his. Her fingers slowly relaxed, and she turned her hand over, palm up, lacing her fingers with his. His calloused hand closed around hers, a firm, reassuring pressure. Yes. The word was unspoken, but she heard it as clearly as if he had shouted it. Yes, you have a place here. Yes, you are welcome. Yes, you can stay. The three of them sat there for a long moment in the warm, flickering light of the fire, their hands joined on the rough wooden table. Tom, seeing the crisis had passed, picked up his spoon and began to eat again. The silence returned to the small cabin, but it was a different silence now. It was no longer heavy with questions and uncertainty. It was a silence filled with a quiet understanding, a fragile but powerful sense of peace. Eliza knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was home. The peace of the valley was a fragile, precious thing, a bubble of quiet that Eliza had come to cherish with a fierce and protective tenderness. The days were measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the shifting angle of the sun. The afternoon had settled into a comfortable, golden warmth. A gentle breeze, carrying the scent of pine and hot dust, billowed the clean laundry she was hanging on a line stretched between the cabin and a solitary juniper tree. The simple, domestic act of pinning a damp shirt in place, the scent of lye soap on her hands, filled her with a profound sense of belonging. Nearby, in the shade of the porch, Tom was meticulously building a small fortress out of twigs and river stones, his brow furrowed in concentration. Silas was down at the corral, his back to her, re-shoeing one of the mustangs. The rhythmic, metallic ring of his hammer against the anvil was a steady, reassuring heartbeat in the quiet of the afternoon. It was a scene of such simple, domestic tranquility that it almost made her heart ache. For the first time, the constant, low-grade fear that had been her shadow for so long had receded completely. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face and allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that this life could be hers. The first sign of trouble was the silence. The hammer blows stopped. Eliza paused. A wooden pin held halfway to the line. She looked toward the corral. Silas was standing perfectly still, his head cocked to one side, listening. His entire body was a study in taut, watchful stillness. The horses in the corral, which had been dozing placidly, were now alert, their heads up, their ears swiveling toward the narrow canyon entrance to the valley. One of them let out a low, nervous whicker. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, began to seep into Eliza's bones, chilling her despite the warmth of the sun. The peaceful bubble had just been pricked. "Eliza!" Silas's voice cut through the air, low and urgent, but devoid of panic. It was the same voice he had used on the train. "Get the boy. Go inside. Bar the door." She didn't question him. She dropped the pins and the damp shirt into the basket and rushed to the porch. "Tom, inside, now," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. The boy looked up, his game forgotten, his eyes wide with a child's intuitive fear. He scrambled to his feet and ran to her. Grabbing a handful of her skirt, she hustled him into the cabin, her heart pounding a frantic, suffocating rhythm against her ribs. She slid the heavy wooden bar across the door, the sound of it thudding into place, offering no comfort at all. She ran to the single window that faced the valley entrance, peering through a small gap in the deerskin covering. 3 riders were emerging from the canyon. They were not moving at a leisurely pace. They rode with a grim, predatory purpose, their horses kicking up plumes of red dust, even from this distance. She recognized the thick, bulky shape of the leader. It was Jed, the man from the train. Her blood ran cold. They had found them. The world she had so carefully, so hopefully, begun to build was about to be torn apart. She pulled Tom close, her arm wrapped tightly around his small, trembling shoulders. He buried his face in her skirt, his fear a palpable thing. Outside, Silas had not moved. He stood alone in the middle of the yard, halfway between the cabin and the corral. He hadn't drawn his weapon, which was holstered at his hip. He simply stood there, his feet planted, a solitary, immovable object waiting for the inevitable collision. The 3 riders fanned out as they approached, their movements practiced and menacing, designed to intimidate and surround. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from Silas, the animals snorting and stamping in the dust. Jed leaned forward in his saddle, a cruel, triumphant smirk twisting his tobacco-stained lips. Well, he drawled, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "Look what we have here, a little slice of paradise, and a lone rider, told you he had something to hide." Silas remained silent, his pale gray eyes moving slowly from Jed to the other two men. One was lean and weaselly, with shifty eyes that darted around the valley, taking everything in. The other was a brute, with a dull, slack-jawed expression and fists like small hams resting on his saddle horn. "We ain't here for you, cowboy," Jed continued, spitting a stream of brown juice into the dust. "We're here for what belongs to Mr. Abernathy, the girl. Send her out, and we'll be on our way. No trouble." "There's no girl here," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as a river stone. Jed chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Don't play dumb with me. We tracked you all the way from the rail line. You're good, I'll give you that. But Abernathy pays better. Now, are you going to send her out? Or are we going to have to come in and get her?" Eliza watched, her knuckles white where she gripped the window frame. She saw Silas's hand move, just a fraction, closer to the pistol at his hip. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "You're not welcome here. Turn your horses and ride out." It happened in a blur of violent motion. Jed gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod. The brute on his right kicked his horse forward, letting out a wild yell, drawing Silas's attention. At the same instant, the weaselly man on the left slid from his saddle and sprinted, low and fast, toward the cabin. Silas half-turned to meet the brute's charge, his hand finally going for his gun, but he had been played. From the corner of his eye, he must have seen the second man flanking him. He tried to pivot back, but it was too late. As the charging horse bore down on him, Jed swung his leg over his saddle, a heavy, wicked-looking pistol already in his hand. He moved with a speed that belied his bulk. Silas managed to get his own gun clear of the holster, but before he could bring it to bear, Jed was on him. He didn't fire the pistol. He used it as a club, bringing the long, heavy barrel down in a vicious, sweeping arc against the side of Silas's head. The sound was a sickening, wet crack that made Eliza cry out. Silas crumpled without a sound, his body folding in on itself like a house of cards. He fell face first into the dust and lay still. A dark, ugly stain began to spread in the dirt beneath his head. The rifle he had been carrying was pinned beneath him. The world seemed to stop. The sun, the breeze, the very air itself held its breath. Inside the cabin, Eliza stared in horror, her mind refusing to process what she had just seen. He was down. He was not moving. The solid, immovable center of her new world had just been broken. A thunderous crash at the door jolted her back to the terrifying present. The weaselly man was throwing his shoulder against it, the wooden bar groaning in protest. "Open up, you little witch," he snarled from the other side. "Get back!" Eliza screamed, her voice thin and reedy with terror. She pushed Tom behind her, her body forming a useless, trembling shield. Another crash, and this time the wood splintered. The man was going to break through. He was going to get in. Jed and the other man were now advancing on the cabin, their boots crunching in the dirt, their expressions confident and cruel. There was nowhere to run. The weaselly man gave one more heave, and the bar shattered, the door flying inward with a violent bang. He stumbled into the room, his eyes wild and greedy. They landed on Eliza, and a nasty grin spread across his face. Then his gaze dropped to the small boy cowering behind her. "Well, now," the man rasped, his eyes lighting up with a cruel idea. "A bonus!" Before Eliza could even scream, he lunged. He shoved her aside with a brutal forearm, sending her stumbling back against the table. He snatched Tom, grabbing a fistful of the boy's shirt and hauling him off his feet. Tom let out a choked cry of terror. The man spun the boy around, clamping a filthy hand over his mouth and pressing the cold, flat blade of a long skinning knife against the side of his throat. "Not a move," the man hissed, his foul breath washing over Eliza. "Not a sound, or the kid gets it." Tom's eyes were huge and white in his terrified face. tears streaming silently down his cheeks. He was completely still, paralyzed by fear. Jed and the brute entered the cabin, filling the small space with their menacing presence. Jed's eyes flickered to the scene, a look of mild annoyance on his face. "There was no need for that, Cal," he grunted, but he made no move to intervene. The boy was a tool, and a useful one at that. Jed's gaze settled on Eliza. He looked her up and down, a possessive, triumphant sneer on his face. "See, this is what happens when you're stubborn. Should have just come out when I asked. Now, we're gonna take you. And we're gonna take whatever is worth taking from this little pigsty. Mr. Abernathy will be very pleased." Eliza's world had shrunk to a single, horrifying point, the glint of steel against Tom's pale skin. The boy who had asked if she was a ghost, who had brought her feathers and stones. Who was Silas's entire world? All the fear, all the terror she had felt for herself, coalesced into something else. It was a cold, hard rage, an emotion so pure and so powerful it burned away everything else. They were not going to harm this child. They were not going to take her. They were not going to destroy this home. Her frantic eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, for anything. And then she saw it, leaning against the wall by the hearth, where Silas had left it after cleaning it that morning, was his rifle, a long, heavy Winchester. It was 10 feet away, an impossible distance. Jed and the brute were between her and it. Cal held the knife to Tom's throat, but it was the only chance they had. She didn't think, she acted. With a desperate, animal cry, she launched herself not at the men but sideways, diving toward the hearth. She hit the floor hard, pain shooting up her arm, but she scrambled forward on her hands and knees. "Grab her!" Jed yelled, taken by surprise. The brute moved to intercept her, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. But she was faster. Her fingers closed around the cool, smooth wood of the rifle stock. It was heavier than she could have ever imagined. An awkward, unwieldy weight. She clutched it to her chest, rolling onto her back and crab-walking away from them, trying to get to her feet. The brute was on her in a second, his massive hand clamped down on her shoulder, his fingers digging in like claws. He started to haul her up, a look of stupid triumph on his face. But as he pulled her, she swung the heavy rifle with all her might, the long barrel catching him squarely in the shins. He howled in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for just an instant. It was all she needed. She tore herself free, scrambled to her feet, and backed away until her shoulders hit the far wall. She fumbled with the rifle, her hands trembling so violently she could barely hold it. She didn't know how to work the lever, how to check if it was loaded. She just pointed the long, heavy barrel into the center of the room. It wavered in her grasp, the front sight dancing wildly. The 3 men stared at her. For a moment, they were frozen, stunned by the sudden, fierce resistance from the girl they had dismissed as a scared rabbit. Then Jed started to laugh, a low, ugly chuckle. "What are you gonna do with that, little girl? You even know which end the bullet comes out of?" Tears were streaming down Eliza's face, tears of terror and rage, but her eyes, fixed on Jed, were blazing. She held the heavy rifle, her small frame straining under its weight, and stood her ground. She was no longer just Eliza, the runaway. She was a shield. She was a protector. She was the only thing standing between these men and the boy she had come to love, the only defense for the unconscious man who had saved her life. "Let him go," she said, her voice a raw, ragged whisper that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Let him go and get out of this house." Jed's laughter echoed in the small, tense space of the cabin, a sound as ugly and out of place as a vulture in a nursery. It was a sound meant to unnerve her, to remind her of her own helplessness, but it had the opposite effect. The raw contempt in his voice burned away the last wisps of her trembling fear and left behind a core of cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just afraid for herself. She was afraid for the unconscious man lying in the dust outside, and for the small, warm body of the boy whose life was balanced on the edge of a knife. That fear was a different, sharper thing. It was a fear that had teeth. The Winchester was a monstrous weight in her arms. Her muscles screamed in protest, and the long barrel swayed, refusing to hold steady. She had never held a firearm in her life. Her father had owned a hunting rifle, but he had forbidden her from ever touching it, declaring it no tool for a lady. She knew nothing of its mechanics, nothing of the violent power coiled within its metal frame. She only knew that it was all that stood between her world and utter ruin. She ignored Jed and the hulking brute who stood beside him. She forced her entire focus onto the weaselly man, Cal, and the glinting blade he held against Tom's throat. The boy's eyes, wide and swimming with unshed tears, were locked on hers. He was looking to her for salvation, and the terrible weight of that trust was both a burden and a source of impossible strength. "I said, let him go," she repeated, her voice steadier this time. Lower. The words felt foreign in her own mouth. Cal's grin was a mirror of Jed's, a twisted, cruel thing. "Or what? You'll shoot me. You'll hit the boy first, you stupid girl." He pressed the knife just a little harder, and a thin red line appeared on Tom's pale skin. A single, perfect tear escaped the boy's eye and traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. The sight of that red line, of that single tear, was like a physical blow. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. There was only the man, the knife, and the child. Eliza drew a ragged breath, her finger tightening on the cold, curved metal of the trigger. She didn't know if the gun was loaded. She didn't know if the safety was on. She was operating on pure, blind instinct. She tried to steady the wavering barrel, tried to align it with the center of Cal's chest. "Last chance," Jed snarled, his amusement finally fading, replaced by a dangerous impatience. He took a step forward, raising his own heavy pistol. "Put the rifle down." The cabin was a pressure cooker of imminent violence, the air thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and spilled blood. Everything was balanced on a knife's edge, ready to fall into chaos. Then, a sound from outside shattered the standoff. Crack! It was a sound that was utterly alien to the small, peaceful valley. A single, sharp, deafening rifle shot that was not her own. It was louder than thunder, a violent punctuation mark that ripped through the tense silence. A splinter of wood flew from the doorframe, inches from Jed's head, and buried itself in the opposite wall. Everyone froze. The sound was so unexpected, so utterly impossible, that for a full second, no one moved. Jed's head whipped around toward the door, his face a mask of stunned confusion. The brute grunted, his eyes wide and stupid. Even Cal, with the knife at Tom's throat, flinched violently, his head jerking toward the source of the sound. His grip on the boy loosened for a fraction of a second. The knife blade pulled away from Tom's skin by a bare inch. It was a moment of grace, a heartbeat of opportunity born from chaos. Eliza didn't know where the shot had come from. She didn't care. She saw only the small gap that had opened between the blade and the boy. Her mind went utterly blank, all thought erased, replaced by a single, primal command from the deepest part of her being. Now. She squeezed the trigger. The world exploded in a cataclysm of fire and noise. The rifle bucked in her arms with the force of a kicking mule, slamming the hard wooden stock back into her shoulder with a brutal, punishing force that felt like it had broken her collarbone. The roar of the gunshot inside the enclosed cabin was a physical blow, a deafening thunderclap that made her ears ring and her teeth ache. Black smoke, stinking of sulfur and burnt powder, filled her nostrils and stung her eyes. The force of the recoil sent her stumbling backwards, her spine hitting the rough log wall with a jarring impact that knocked the breath from her lungs. She had no idea where the bullet had gone. Her eyes had been squeezed shut at the last second. Through the ringing in her ears and the acrid smoke, she heard a choked, wet scream of agony. Her eyes flew open. Cal was staggering backward, his face a contorted mask of shock and excruciating pain. His hand flew to his right shoulder, where a dark, blossoming stain was spreading rapidly across the fabric of his shirt. The skinning knife clattered to the floor. Forgotten. His hold on Tom was gone. The boy, released from the grip of terror, reacted with the pure, unthinking instinct of a freed animal. He didn't hesitate. He launched himself across the small space, a small, desperate projectile, and crashed into Eliza's legs. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in the folds of her skirt, his small body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. Eliza's arms, weak and trembling from the rifle's recoil, dropped the heavy weapon. It fell to the floor with a loud clatter. She collapsed down, her own legs no longer able to support her, and gathered the boy into her arms. She held him tight, her cheek pressed against the top of his dusty blonde head, her own tears now flowing freely, hot and cleansing. The scene in the cabin had been utterly transformed. The balance of power had violently shifted. Jed and the brute stared, momentarily stunned, at their wounded companion, who had stumbled back against the wall, clutching his shoulder and moaning, his face a pasty, sweating white. "I'm hit, Jed! I'm hit!" Cal gasped, his eyes wide with panic. Jed's face was a storm of fury and, for the first time, uncertainty. He was a bully, a predator who thrived on intimidating the weak. He was not a soldier prepared for a pitched battle. He had a wounded man, a girl who had just proven herself willing and able to shoot, and, most importantly, an unknown shooter somewhere outside. One shooter. A whole posse. The valley that had seemed like a perfect, isolated trap was now a box with an unknown number of guns pointed at it. The odds were no longer in his favor. Another crack from the rifle outside, closer this time, underscored the point. This bullet didn't hit the cabin. It struck the ground right in front of the open door, kicking up a spray of dust that made the brute yelp and jump back. It was a warning shot, a clear, deliberate message. That was all it took. The illusion of their superiority was shattered. "Forget the girl," Jed snarled, his eyes darting nervously toward the open doorway. "Let's go grab him." The brute, needing no further encouragement, moved to the moaning Cal. He grabbed his wounded partner by the arm and half dragged, half carried him toward the door. Cal stumbled along, whimpering in pain, leaving a smear of blood on the wall and a small, dark trail on the floorboards. Jed backed out of the cabin slowly, his pistol still raised, pointed vaguely in Eliza's direction, but his eyes were on the unseen threat outside. His bravado was gone, replaced by the frantic, cornered look of a coyote that had just heard the click of a trap. He was the last one out the door, and then he turned and ran. Eliza heard the frantic sounds of their retreat, panicked shouts, the jingle of harness, the thud of boots, and then the desperate, frantic drumming of horses' hooves galloping away, the sound growing fainter and fainter until it was finally swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the valley. They were gone. The sudden quiet that descended on the cabin was as shocking as the noise had been. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire, the high-pitched ringing in Eliza's ears, and Tom's ragged, hiccuping sobs as he clung to her. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of blood. Sunlight streamed through the open, shattered door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the smoky air. For a long moment, Eliza just knelt there on the floor, holding the boy, her mind a complete blank. The adrenaline that had surged through her, giving her impossible strength, drained away, leaving her weak, nauseous, and trembling uncontrollably. Her shoulder was a massive, throbbing bruise where the rifle had kicked her. Her ears rang, her whole body ached, but Tom was safe. They were safe. A shadow fell across the doorway. Eliza flinched, her body tensing, a fresh wave of fear washing over her. But it was not Jed. The man who stood there was older, perhaps in his 50s, with a deeply lined, sun-weathered face and a thick, graying mustache. He was wiry and tough, dressed in worn buckskins, and he held a long-barreled rifle in his hands with a casual, familiar ease. His dark eyes, sharp and intelligent, took in the scene in an instant: the shattered door, the blood on the floor, Eliza and the boy huddled together, and finally, the still form of Silas lying in the yard. His face, which had been hard and grim, softened with a look of profound concern. "Silas," he breathed, the name a prayer. He moved past them without a word, his steps quick and sure, and knelt beside Silas's body. Eliza watched, her heart in her throat, as the old man gently, carefully, rolled Silas onto his back. Silas's face was pale as death, his eyes closed. The side of his head was a matted, bloody mess. For a terrible, eternal second, Eliza was certain he was dead. But then the old man pressed his fingers to Silas's neck. His shoulders sagged with a visible wave of relief. "He's breathing," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He looked over his shoulder at Eliza, his dark eyes meeting hers. "He's alive." Time seemed to fracture in the aftermath of the violence. The world, which had been a chaotic whirlwind of noise and terror, slowed to a thick, syrupy crawl. Eliza knelt on the floor, the dead weight of the rifle beside her, Tom's small, shuddering body clutched in her arms. She watched as the old man, this impossible savior, worked over Silas with a gentle, practiced urgency. "We have to get him inside," the man said, his voice a low command that cut through her daze. He introduced himself with a simple, gruff nod. "Name's Raoul. Worked for his PA. Years back. I try to check in on him and the boy every few weeks. Looks like I came at the right time." His words provided a thread of logic in a world that had come undone. Together, they became a team, their movements synchronized by the desperate, singular goal of saving Silas's life. Raoul was surprisingly strong for his wiry frame. He took Silas's shoulders, and Eliza, after settling a still trembling Tom on the porch with a blanket, took his legs. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unnervingly still. They half carried, half dragged him into the cabin, leaving a dark, smeared trail in the dust he had so recently stood upon to defend them. They laid him on his own bed, a simple pallet of furs and blankets in the corner of the room. In the dim light of the cabin, the injury looked even worse. It was a deep, ugly gash just above his temple, matted with blood and dirt, the skin around it already beginning to swell and darken into a ghastly purple. His face was a waxy, unnatural white, and his breathing was shallow, a faint, rasping sound that was the only proof he was still alive. A new kind of fear seized Eliza, a cold, methodical terror that was different from the hot panic of the fight. Before, she had feared for her life, for Tom's. Now, she feared for his, the possibility that he might die, that this quiet, solid man who had become the anchor of her world might just slip away into the silence, was an agony she could not bear to contemplate. "Water," Raoul grunted, already moving to the hearth, "and clean cloths. All you can find, boil the water first." His practical commands were a lifeline. They gave her a purpose, a set of tasks to perform that kept the overwhelming despair at bay. While Raoul built up the fire, his movements swift and sure, Eliza tore strips from one of her own clean petticoats, her hands shaking but her mind clear. She had nursed her mother through her final fever. She knew the grim, relentless rhythm of the sick room. The hours that followed blurred into a waking nightmare of quiet, desperate work. Raoul, with a knowledge of healing herbs that could only have come from a lifetime spent in the wilderness, cleaned the wound. Eliza held the basin, her stomach churning at the sight, but her hands remained steady. They packed the gash with a poultice of crushed leaves that Raoul had retrieved from his saddlebags, the sharp, medicinal scent filling the small cabin. They bandaged his head with the strips of her petticoat, the clean white a stark contrast to his blood-darkened hair. Raoul stayed through the first night. He sat in a chair he pulled to the bedside, his rifle across his lap, a silent, weary sentinel. He would occasionally rise to check on Silas, to feel his forehead, to listen to his breathing. He brewed a pot of coffee so strong and black it was almost sludge, and he and Eliza drank from it in a shared, silent vigil. Tom, his terror finally spent, had cried himself to sleep on his small cot, his small hand clutching a corner of his blanket like a talisman. "He's strong," Raoul said once, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of the night. He was staring at Silas's still face, his own face etched with a deep, weary concern. His PA was the same, tough as an old juniper root. "He'll fight." The words were meant to be a comfort, but they only underscored the reality of the situation. Silas was in a fight for his life, and all they could do was watch, and wait, and hope. The next morning, Raoul declared he had to leave. "My own stock needs tending," he said, his gaze apologetic. "But I'll be back. 2 days, maybe 3. Keep him warm. Try to get some broth into him if he stirs. The fever will be the worst part." He left them with a small pouch of the dried herbs, a sack of jerky, and a final, long look at the unconscious man in the bed. Then he was gone, a solitary rider disappearing back into the canyon from which he had come, leaving Eliza and Tom alone with the silence and the shallow, rasping sound of Silas's breathing. The days that followed were a crucible. Time lost its shape, measured not in sunrises and sunsets, but in the changing state of the man in the bed. Eliza became his shadow, his anchor to the living world. She rarely left his side, sleeping in brief, fitful snatches on a blanket on the floor beside his pallet. She became a fierce, tireless nurse. She bathed his face and hands with cool water, trying to keep the fever at bay as it rose, turning his skin to fire. She forced sips of water and, later, thin broth between his cracked lips, a slow, painstaking process that sometimes took the better part of an hour. She changed his bandages, her touch gentle, her stomach clenching each time at the sight of the angry, inflamed wound. She talked to him, her voice a low, constant murmur in the quiet room. She told him about her day, about the hawk she had seen, about the picture Tom had drawn. She told him he was strong, that he had to fight, that they were waiting for him. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she couldn't bear the thought of him being alone in the darkness. Her world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. The frantic, terrified girl who had stumbled into this valley was gone, burned away in the heat of the fight and the relentless demands of the sick room. In her place was a woman she did not recognize, a woman of quiet, unyielding strength. This small, fragile world, this wounded man, this quiet boy had become hers to protect, and she defended it with a fierce, maternal devotion she had never known she possessed. Tom was her silent partner in the vigil. The trauma of the attack had changed him, stripping him of his childish chatter and leaving behind a solemn, watchful gravity. He stayed close, always within sight of the cabin. He would sit for hours on the floor by Silas's bed, a piece of charcoal and a smooth piece of scrap wood in his hands. He would draw, his brow furrowed in concentration. At first, his pictures were of the bad men, stick figures with angry, scribbled faces and knives in their hands. But as the days passed, his drawings changed. He drew the cabin, with a plume of smoke rising from the chimney. He drew one of the horses, its legs comically thin. He drew Raoul, a tall figure with a big hat and a rifle, and he drew Eliza, a figure with long hair, stirring a pot over the fire. Raoul returned as promised, his arrival a blessed relief. He brought fresh supplies and a quiet, calming presence. He would sit with Silas, allowing Eliza to walk outside, to stretch her aching back and breathe air that wasn't thick with the scent of sickness. He would help her cook, his hands surprisingly deft as he chopped vegetables for a soup, his quiet commentary on the state of the horses or the weather a small, comforting anchor to the normal world that existed outside the cabin walls. One afternoon, A full week after the attack, the fever finally broke. Eliza had been dozing in a chair, her head lolling against her chest, a book resting in her lap, Tom's tattered primer, which she had been reading aloud in a low, soothing voice. A subtle change in the rhythm of Silas's breathing woke her. She was instantly alert, her eyes flying to his face. The angry flush was gone from his skin. It was still pale, terribly pale, but it was cool and dry to the touch. A sheen of sweat covered his forehead, and his breathing, while still shallow, was deeper and more regular than it had been in days. The crisis had passed. He had fought, and he had won. A sob of pure, overwhelming relief caught in her throat. She sank back into the chair, her body trembling with the release of a week's worth of tension. She laid her hand on his, her fingers gently tracing the hard, calloused skin. He was still unconscious, but he was here. He was going to live. She must have drifted off again, lulled by the steady sound of his breathing. She was woken by a faint, dry whisper, a voice so hoarse and unfamiliar she thought at first she had dreamed it. Still here. Her eyes snapped open. He was awake. His own eyes were open, just slits at first, struggling against the light. They were cloudy with pain and confusion, but they were focused on her. He was looking right at her. The question, so simple, so utterly unexpected, struck her with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't asking what had happened. He wasn't asking about the men or the fight. In his first lucid moment, his first thought, his first words were for her, a question laced with a faint, wondering disbelief, as if her continued presence was a miracle he had not dared to expect. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his face into a watery mirage. They were not tears of sadness or fear, but of a joy so profound and so overwhelming it was painful. A laugh, a watery, choked sound, escaped her lips, a sound that was half sob, half pure, unadulterated happiness. She squeezed his hand, her grip conveying everything her voice could not. She leaned forward, her face close to his, so he could see her through his pain, so there could be no doubt. "Here," she whispered, the tears now streaming freely down her cheeks, dripping onto their joined hands, and not going anywhere. Silas's return to the world was a slow, quiet dawn, not a sudden sunrise. The days that followed his waking were a delicate, fragile time, filled with long stretches of silence and the careful relearning of simple things. For Eliza, the frantic, desperate rhythm of nursing gave way to a different kind of care, one that was quieter, more intimate, and in some ways, more difficult. He was a terrible patient, not because he was demanding, but because his silence, once a source of strength, was now a mask for his weakness and frustration. He would lie for hours, his pale gray eyes open, staring at the log ceiling, his jaw set in a hard line. He hated being helpless. He hated the way his hands trembled when he tried to lift a cup of water, the way a wave of dizziness would wash over him if he tried to sit up too quickly. Eliza learned to read the subtle language of his frustration, the slight tightening of his lips, the faint tremor in his hand. She would pretend not to notice, simply steadying the cup for him or placing another pillow behind his back without a word. She moved around the small cabin with a quiet efficiency, her presence a constant, soothing balm. She kept the fire low, the light dim, and the cabin filled with a gentle, healing sense of broth and Raoul's herbs. Tom was the bridge between them. He seemed to understand, with a child's simple wisdom, that what Silas needed most was not coddling, but normalcy. He would sit on the floor beside the pallet, not with the solemnity of the vigil, but with his old, focused intensity. He would show Silas the pictures he had drawn, pointing out the crooked lines of the cabin or the impressive size of the horse he'd imagined. He would narrate his day in a low, rambling monologue, talking about the fat lizard he'd seen or the way the clouds looked like a herd of sheep. He asked nothing of Silas, simply included him, pulling him back into the rhythm of their daily life with the gentle, insistent tug of his childish chatter. Slowly, painstakingly, Silas began to mend. The deep, angry gash on his head closed, leaving a raw, red scar that disappeared into his hairline. The color returned to his face, and the strength began to seep back into his limbs. The first time he managed to stand on his own, leaning heavily on the wall, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. He and Eliza had looked at each other across the room. No words were exchanged, but a current of shared triumph, of profound relief, passed between them. A silent acknowledgement of the long, dark road they had just traveled together. As the weeks bled into a month, the memory of the violence began to fade, replaced by the steady, comforting pulse of life returning to its familiar cycles. The brutal heat of high summer softened into the golden languor of late summer. The days settled back into their old rhythm, but the rhythm itself had changed. It was the same song, but played in a different key. There was a new depth to their shared silence, a new weight to the small, everyday gestures. The morning would begin with the scent of coffee and frying bacon. Eliza would move around the kitchen, her hands now sure and capable. No longer the hands of a frightened girl, but the hands of a woman who knew her place. Silas, his movements still a little stiff, would head out to the corral to tend to the horses, his long shadow stretching before him in the early morning light. Tom would be somewhere in between, a small, energetic planet orbiting the two suns of his small universe. The work of the day would unfold in a comfortable, parallel motion, while Eliza washed their clothes in the clear, cold water of the stream, her skirts hitched up around her knees. Silas would be mending the section of fence that had been broken during the attack. He worked with a slow, deliberate patience, his hammer blows ringing out in the clear air, a sound that was no longer an alarm, but a reassurance. It was the sound of rebuilding, of making things whole again. And Tom, his work with the primer done, would run through the tall, dry grass, his laughter a bright, carefree sound under the vast, empty sky, a testament to the resilience of childhood and the healing power of peace. They rarely spoke of the attack. There was no need. It was a part of their shared history now, a dark thread that was woven so tightly into the fabric of their lives that it could never be removed. But it was not the only thread. There were brighter ones. Too, the shared meal, the quiet evening, the unspoken understanding that passed between them in a single glance. One evening, as the sun began to dip behind the western mesas, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Eliza found Silas sitting on the edge of the porch, staring out at the darkening valley. His rifle was resting across his knees, but his hands were gentle on it, his posture relaxed. The angry scar on his head was just a pale line now, a quiet reminder of how close she had come to losing him. She came and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a long time, they just sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, listening to the evening sounds of the desert, the chirping of the crickets, the distant, lonely call of a coyote, the soft sigh of the wind as it moved through the sagebrush. The first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, pinpricks of cold, distant light in the deep, velvety indigo. She thought back to that first night, to the terror and the darkness of the rattling freight car. She remembered the feeling of his heavy duster around her, the solid, unmovable wall of his back, the slow, steady beat of his heart against her ear. He had been a refuge then, a dark, silent place for her to hide from the world. She looked at him now. His face, in the soft twilight, had lost some of its harshness. The lines around his eyes seemed softer, his mouth less grim. He was no longer just a protector, a silent stranger. He was Silas, the man whose life she had held in her hands, whose recovery she had willed with every fiber of her being, the center of her world. The words rose in her heart, simple and true, and she knew she had to speak them. She had to close the final distance between them, to turn this unspoken understanding into a solid, unbreakable thing. She leaned her head against his shoulder. It was a simple, natural movement, and he did not stiffen or pull away. He simply accepted the weight of her, a silent invitation. His shirt was rough against her cheek, and he smelled of leather, dust, and the clean scent of the desert air. It was the scent of home. "I used to just want to hide in your duster," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost carried away by the evening breeze. He turned his head slightly, and she could feel his gaze on her, though she kept her own fixed on the rising stars. "I was so scared, and all I wanted was to be invisible, to disappear into the folds of your coat and let the world pass me by." She paused, gathering her courage. This was more than a confession. It was a declaration. "But I don't want to hide any more," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet strength. Now I want to stand beside you, in the rain, in the sun, through the hard winters and the long summers. I want to build a life here, with you, with Tom." She finally lifted her head and looked at him, her heart in her eyes. "Forever." The word hung in the quiet air between them, as vast and as full of promise as the star-dusted sky above. It was everything she had to offer, her past, her present, her future. It was a question, a plea, and a promise all in one. Silas looked at her, his pale gray eyes searching her face in the dim light. She saw a flicker of something in their depths, something ancient and profound, a deep, weary loneliness she had never seen before, and then a slow, dawning light of a hope he had long since abandoned. He was a man who had built walls around his heart to protect it, and she was asking him to let her in. He didn't speak. He was not a man of easy words or grand declarations. His language was one of action, of quiet, irrefutable deeds. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing with hers. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to her knuckles, a gesture of such startling tenderness it made her breath catch in her throat. Then he simply held her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it, his gaze quiet and deep. He looked from her face to the small, warm light of the cabin, where Tom was already asleep, and then back to her. He gave her hand a slight, firm squeeze. It was not a passionate embrace, not a flowery promise. It was something more. It was a silent, solemn contract, signed and sealed under the watchful eyes of the desert stars. It was a promise that needed no words, a quiet, unshakable vow that echoed in the vast, peaceful silence of the valley. It was the answer to every question she had ever asked, and every prayer she had ever whispered. It was yes. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us know what part of the world you're in. It's always amazing to see how these tales of the Old West travel far and wide. Share your thoughts with us. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach even more listeners, please hit that hype button to show your support.